Why aren't people naturally and spontaneously wholly good? Bruce Charlton. It seems evident to me that nobody is naturally and spontaneously good, that is, nobody lives wholly in harmony with God's creation and intentions. Indeed, we don't, any of us, get anywhere near this ideal. I.e., we are all sinners, as Jesus said. Why should this be? Why is it that, as created beings dwelling in a wholly good God's creation, we are not wholly good? My answer is that we ourselves are not wholly created beings, but are instead eternal beings who existed from before divine creation, and therefore we are now a mixture of God's creation and our primordial selves. Our primordial selves are what make us genuinely free beings, and also what means that we are not wholly aligned with divine creation. That we are mixed entails that some of what makes us is a product of divine creation, and some of what makes us is not. Thus we find ourselves. We know from experience what it is to be in harmony with God's creative will, and we also know otherwise. At one level, this finite mortal life is therefore a time of choice, when that which is free in us needs to make a choice whether to affiliate with God's creation or not. We are what we are, and in terms of God's purpose for our mortal lives, this means that we're not meant to be naturally and spontaneously wholly good, but to make this choice. Do we want to commit fully and eternally to live in harmony with God's creation, in which case we choose to follow Jesus Christ to heaven, that being the method by which such a goal is attained? Or, do we want to disengage from creation, and return to something like the primordial state of isolation, non-communication with other beings, a state of barely conscious beingness? Or, do we choose to oppose God and divine creation? Perhaps because we resent having been co-opted into this scheme in the first place, or because we dislike our presumed role and situation in the scheme of creations, or because the price of choosing heaven is too great, i.e. we do not want to live forever wholly by love, or for any reason. That is the choice of this mortal life, and there are no other options. Whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad, true. But why? Bruce Charlton. I am thinking, here, about the Western leadership class. That they are mad is clear, that they are en route to utter destruction I believe. That is where the madness comes in. That the gods wish to extirpate the Western leadership class seems obvious, and the reasons why are also obvious, but for the requisite irreversible annihilation certainly to happen requires that the elites become insane, not merely in losing their spontaneous sense of self-preservation, but actively willing self-annihilation. Otherwise, sans lunacy, a sane elite would pull back just enough to avert nemesis, and survive to wreak further havoc. Since the gods want to ensure this does not happen, they first ensure that the Western leadership are mad. Elections. William Wildblood. Right and left are largely meaningless terms nowadays, but they are still used because it suits the establishment to perpetuate its power with this charade. The two sides give the illusion of choice but are just variations on the same theme. Most people know this but go along with it anyway as there seems no alternative. Now there is the bogeyman of the far right used to terrorize the sheep back into the fold. Quite soon a person will be described as far right who loves his country, respects the laws of nature, thinks men and women are different, honors beauty, believes in God and behaves accordingly, is a Christian. This last point shows the way forward. There is no political solution to the downward spiral in which we find ourselves. The only solution is spiritual. It always has been, but the peculiar nature of our time is that this will become ever more apparent and eventually reach a point at which it cannot be ignored without a conscious effort of denial. If you feel like lamenting the loss of your country, remember that your true home is not here. Use the destruction of your earthly home positively, as a stimulus to focus your thoughts on where you really need to go. My kingdom is not of this world. 2 Ways of Understanding Apocalypse. Francis Berger. An especially useful tidbit I gleaned from Badiaf is that there are 2 ways of understanding apocalypse, a passive way and an active way. Badiaf observed that the passive way of understanding apocalypse has always predominated Christian consciousness via a sense of foreboding and passive waiting for the end, because most Christians believe that the fate of the world is determined by God exclusively, divine judgment and all that. From another perspective, the end of the world is not an exclusively divine matter. Man also participates in the world, be it creatively or destructively. Seen this way, the end of the world also depends on man's activity. So, how should man approach the end of the world? On the one hand, he can assume it is all in God's hands and wait for the inevitable in passive terror, or prepare for it actively and creatively. According to Badiaf, apocalyptic consciousness can be conservative and reactionary, or revolutionary and creative. The world is always coming to an end. At the same time, the world is also always beginning. The world has ended countless times in history, and every time some movement in history drew to a close, another emerged. Movements of history aside, the individual world of every person ends in a personal apocalypse. The world may continue despite everything, but we know beyond a doubt that we as individuals will not, at least not in this mortal coil. Whether the world ends should be of secondary significance to the certainty of our mortal lives ending. How will we choose to face our individual apocalypses when they arrive? The same way we choose to face the end of the world apocalypse. Will we stare aghast in horror at the ruin of everything we sanctified, or will we greet our inevitable demise actively and creatively? Will we fixate on the end and see no more, or will we recognize the end as a beginning and concentrate on preparing for that beginning with creativity, hope, and love? If we spent more time being revolutionary and creative about the inevitable end of our personal worlds, we could change the tentative end of the world into something that it ought to be. Materialism, Oneness, Christian, 3 Incompatible Worldviews. Bruce Charlton. 1. Mainstream Western secular materialism. This world is entropic, life arises accidentally from unlife and soon reverts to it. All that is personal and distinct is temporary and tends towards disorder. Annihilation of everything is the ultimate destination. 2. Oneness. This world began and ends as one, anything else is illusion. The tendency is towards dissolution of all that is distinct, all beings, all persons, all things, ourselves. 3. Christian. The persons, beings, forms of this entropic and illusory world, are a learning stage or phase, en route to the potential choice of eternal resurrection. The distinctively Christian essence of resurrection is that our ultimate goal and destiny can be one in which some individual persons, beings, life, forms, order and structure, may choose to become everlasting. These 3 worldviews are incompatible. Only one can be real, and we can choose only one. I think it is best to consider which we would most desire for ourselves, and if the answer is Christian, then recognize that our destiny is one that we must, therefore shall, choose. Cosmic Order. William Wildblood. Maut and Ratu are 2 words signifying concepts whose meaning we have almost completely lost today. The first comes from ancient Egypt, the second from ancient India, and they mean more or less the same thing, which is truth, universal order, or simply that which is right. The cosmos is built on these things, and the earthly state or nation should reflect that, as should the microcosm, the inner state of the human being. The human soul should conform to Maut if it is to walk the correct path, and the nation must be based on its principles if it is to be favored by the gods and prosper. As soon as these principles are deserted because of human corruption or sin, or for whatever reason, the benevolence of the gods will be withdrawn and things will start to fall apart. The nation may even be conquered by outside forces or overrun by uncivilized, barbaric elements. In Egyptian theology, Maut was personified as a goddess, sometimes shown with wings symbolizing her divine origin. She was the daughter of Ra, the creator god, so high up in the hierarchy of spiritual beings. She represented the order and harmony of the universe, the pattern on which it was designed and the principles according to which it should be governed. She was also of great importance in determining the post-mortem destination of the soul. After death, every soul was required to enter the hall of judgment, where its heart would be weighed on a set of scales set against Maut's feather of truth. If the heart balanced with the feather, then Thoth, the god of wisdom, would record that fact, and the soul would be admitted by Osiris to the Sekhet Aru, or field of reeds, which was the Egyptian heavenly paradise. If, on the other hand, the heart was heavier than the feather, it would be consumed by the goddess Amit, who combined the features of crocodile, lion and hippopotamus, these being the most fearsome beasts known to the ancient Egyptians. This grim fate implied the destruction of the soul. Such was the importance of living by the principles of Ma', the judgment of the soul with Osiris, far right, and the feather of Maut in the right-hand scale. The jackal-headed god Anubis officiates. It expresses a very similar idea. It describes cosmic and moral order and is mentioned over 300 times in the Rig Veda, which is the oldest Sanskrit text currently regarded as dating back to the 2nd millennium BC. The chief god at that time, the sky and ocean god Varuna, is called the king of Ritu, and through its power restores the good order lost from time to time because of sin and ignorance. However, even he is subject to Ritu in the sense that it precedes him in the order of creation, so he may serve and exemplify it, but its origin lies further back than the gods. In ancient India, the word itself faded from use, but its meaning persisted in the idea of Dharma, which became fundamental to Hindu religion. These two words convey a similar meaning to the idea of the Tao as used by C.S. Lewis in his book The Abolition of Man. This is more his adoption of the term than the traditional Chinese sense of the word as the mysterious undercurrent of being, but it fits in with that well enough. For Lewis, it is a universal moral structure that transcends the vagaries of the times and cultures in which it may be expressed. It is not verifiable by conventional scientific means because its ground lies in the realm of first principles which cannot be proved as they just are. Lewis traces its presence through many religious traditions, all of which had intuited the reality of this natural law as we may think of it. But today we have lost touch with it because we have abandoned the sense of a transcendental absolute. Indeed, a definition of modernity could be that it is the triumph of relativism, which might have seemed reasonable at one point but inevitably just ends up in nihilism. Maut, Ritu, the Tao, all these things point in the same direction, to an eternal, absolute, unchanging, incorruptible reality. We need to rediscover the truth of that reality and start to build our lives and our cultures on that basis. It is flexible enough to allow for different expressions of the one truth, but these will differ only in form. In essence, they will be one. However, we must also remember that since Christ's natural virtue, which is what Maut etc. call for, is no longer enough. Piety, worship of the gods, following the path of Dharma, supported by the traditional four cardinal virtues of justice, prudence, temperance and fortitude, are the foundation, but on these must be built the house, and that is constructed of the spiritual virtues of faith, hope and charity. The difference is that whereas the natural virtues can be acquired through right thinking and human effort, the spiritual virtues can only come from God, though God will only bestow them to the soul that has made itself ready to receive them. This should tell us that faith, hope and charity, spiritually considered, are rather more than they are conventionally thought to be, as anyone can have them in an ordinary sense, but in the proper spiritual sense they are gifts of the Holy Spirit and so qualitatively different to the human versions. Without the idea of an overarching absolute, human beings have nothing to anchor themselves to reality, and so will make up all sorts of fantastic notions to further their ambitions, desires and goals. But these can never go beyond the limitations of human experience, and the human soul is so constituted that it must do this or suffer spiritually. The rediscovery of Maut is essential if we are not to drown in relativism. The Old Vicarage, Grantchester by Rupert, Brooke. Bruce Charlton.
Say, is there beauty yet to find? And certainty? And quiet kind? Deep meadows yet, for to forget the lies, and truths, and pain? Oh, yet stands the church clock at 10 to 3? And is there honey still for tea?
These final lines of Rupert Brooke's 1912 poem are perhaps the most famous, because so yearningly evocative, expressions of Edwardian nostalgia, which seem to foreshadow the terrible losses, and in Brooke's case, death on active service, suffered by the gilded youth of the English upper classes in the 1914-18 war. And of all such youth, Brooke was certainly the most gilded, since he was so perfect an example of the then ideal of male beauty as to have become the center of a considerable and worshipping cult, and being English upper class, this was from both sexes. All of which does not much endear him to me. Brooke was, indeed, a Norman among Normans. Yet, in his longish poem Grantchester, Brooke achieved a marvelously enjoyable and satisfying piece of verse. The whole poem is actually of considerable complexity, having the epigraph Café des Westerns, Berlin, May 1912, so the setup is of Brooke, sitting abroad in Germany, miserable, and remembering the happiest year of his life living in Grantchester, a village situated a few miles along the river from Cambridge University, where he was an undergraduate. What is startling after this introductory section, which contains another section that has entered common parlance.
Oh, there the chestnuts, summer through, beside the river make for you a tunnel of green gloom, and sleep. Deeply above, and green and deep, the stream mysterious glides beneath. Green as a dream and deep as death.
Is that there arrives a section of superb comic verse.
God, I will pack, and take a train, and get me to England once again. For England's the one land, I know, where men with splendid hearts may go. And Cambridgeshire, of all England, the shire for men who understand. And of that district I prefer the lovely hamlet Grantchester.
Yet, despite his hyperbolically expressed love of Cambridgeshire, albeit knowingly inaccurate. Because Grantchester is not a hamlet but a village, a parish with a church, Brooke then, with deliberate absurdity, lists many towns and villages near to Grantchester, and waspishly, and arbitrarily, satirizes them for their various supposed inferiorities.
And folks in Shelford and those parts have twisted lips and twisted hearts. And Barton men make cockney rhymes. And Cotton's full of nameless crimes. And things are done you'd not believe at Mattingley on Christmas Eve.
Light or comic verse must exhibit technical perfection, and this does, and more generally Grantchester is remarkable for the way in which its short line rhymed couplets remain continually interesting and surprising, despite that this is probably the dullest of all verse forms. Witness most of the 18th century English poets, Pope, Dryden, Johnson, who I find all but unreadable. Probably my favorite humorous section of the poem comes somewhat earlier, describing a ghostly fairy tale scene, set in the immediate surroundings of the Grantchester Old Vicarage where Brooke dwelt during his glorious year.
And in that garden, black and white, creep whispers through the grass all night, and spectral dance, before the dawn, 100 vicars down the lawn. Curates, long dust, will come and go, on lissom, clerical, printless toe. And oft between the boughs is seen the sly shade of a rural dean.
I would indeed classify Grantchester as verse, rather than poetry. As I understand it, it is an exemplar of the classical rather than romantic tradition. Its considerable delights are not at the very highest level. And, as for Brooke himself, he is best appreciated as the original basis of what soon became an archetypal ideal. By contrast, I find the historical biographical reality of his life among the Cambridge Apostles, the Bloomsbury Group and Fabian Society to be repellent, sordid, corrupt. Best ignored, or viewed through a rose-tinted retrospectoscope. And, of course, properly understood and responded to, the legend is what matters most. This post was triggered by a couple of visits to Grantchester over past months, eating lunch in the orchard tea garden that contains a little Rupert Brooke museum. And then picking up, from a sales display at St Andrew and St Mary's Church, Grantchester, a very enjoyable photographic and explanatory edition of the poem, done by a couple of the local residents, which I recommend to anyone intrigued by my comments above. Rupert Brooke's Grantchester, by Francis Burkitt and Christine Jennings, 2010. You've got to believe in doesn't work anymore. Now, you need to know, directly. Bruce Charlton. When so many people expend so much energy propagating that you've got to believe in something, then you eventually realize that nobody really believes in anything. For a long time, people could be induced to believe in things by social structuring, then for a while more belief was created and sustained by inducing people to participate in rituals, study, self-disciplines, and then that phase passed. For a short period more, it was widely asserted that this inability to believe meant that anyone could believe anything, simply by choosing. Someone could, by wanting, learn to believe in yourself, or believe in any kind of religion, spirituality, or political ideology. Someone could, it was said, induce belief by replacing external social structures with a personally chosen framework. The implicit theory was something like this. First, you chose what to believe. Then you build your own belief-sustaining system. Finally, you stepped inside and believed, from then onwards. Yet that interchangeability of belief also implied that if you could believe anything, then you ought to believe whatever was currently approved/imposed by the rulers. Because if not, if there was no consensus of belief, then chaos would ensue, than which anything is better, so most people felt. Meanwhile, nobody really believed anything, because belief was, for pretty obvious reasons, self-subverted by its own arbitrariness. If we can believe anything then, actually, we cannot believe anything. And that is where things now stand. Believe in doesn't work. Now, what we need is to know. And that means we need to know without having first to believe in. And that means we need to know directly, by a single inner act of knowing that does not depend on any intermediaries that must be believed in. That is, we need to know without believing that words/concepts/symbols capture real reality. We need to know without having first to believe in some particular person or institution, or church. Direct knowing in this way can be called intuition, and it not only can but must become the ultimate basis for life, because it is the only potentially solid basis, the only basis that is not merely a floating island adrift in the sea of culture. Direct knowing is when the island of our expressed belief is merely the tip of a root that extends to the bedrock of reality. And on that rock, motivation trumps power. Bruce Charlton. In this UK and US election year, people are induced to focus on power, and what they think they might do with it if they got it, or what those we most dislike might do it as if the power went to them. But in a society in which evil motivations predominate, and where personal motivation is at an all-time historical nadir, such that people are easily induced to be motivated for or against almost anything, and then abandon or reverse this motivation on a sixpence. In such a society of endemic, pervasive, near-universal demotivation and false motivations, the distribution of power is of very subordinate relevance. Unless the problem of motivation is first solved, that is, unless people are motivated towards good rather than evils, and their motivations are internal and personal rather than passively responsive to external manipulation, then distribution of power is almost irrelevant. In a situation where good is absent altogether, or motivated so feebly as to be a misleading distraction, we can, and are encouraged to, analyze and quibble about the lesser of evils, which particular fake puppet personality we prefer from a caste of obedient drones and controllable psychopaths. But all available options are wrongly motivated, therefore all options are evil, and, in a complicated and chaotic world, a world consisting of distortion, hype and outright lies, which particular option is the least evil cannot be predicted. The imperative is to recognize just how very bad things are, ultimately in a spiritual sense, and that from this spiritual corruption comes the situation of endemic, pervasive, near-universal demotivation and false motivations. Hardly anyone I speak with or read seems remotely to realize the depth and extent of our current civilizational malaise, and this indictment includes all the most famous and influential dissenting voices. From where we actually are, the only positive way forward entails a transformation and reversal of many of those assumptions that we hold most dear, or regard as obvious and unchallengeable. That is just how it is. Whether it is at all likely to happen, is another matter. But that's what must happen, else present trends will continue towards predictably destructive ends. From obedient love to chosen love, premortal to postmortal life. Bruce Charlton. My understanding is that we originated in terms of divine creation as spirit beings, living in a situation of obedient love with respect to God. In that sense we began as angels, perfectly good servants and messengers of God, but without agency, i.e. free will. This was our spiritual childhood, because we loved by means of obedience. We found ourselves living in God's love, but unconsciously, therefore passively and spontaneously we accepted love as the basis for life and creation. As consciousness developed, some beings developed faster than others, and probably some did not develop to this point. We became agents capable of choice. Capable of choosing to accept or reject our then current state. We became capable of choosing to reject the state of living in love. Then some premortal spirits, i.e. the demons, and perhaps the devil first of all, chose to reject and oppose God and divine creation. The rejectors remain as premortal spirits, but have chosen disobedience to God and opposition to divine creation. Thus evil entered creation. Others chose the next step in development, which is to incarnate as immortal beings, after which temporary phase there is the opportunity actively to choose to live eternally in love, as resurrected incarnate beings in the state of heaven. Thus, we begin as spirits unconsciously living in a childlike state of obedient love, then, due to Jesus Christ's work, those of us who chose the temporary path of mortal incarnation will have the opportunity consciously to opt into living eternally in a mature adult state of chosen love. The premortal state is one of living wholly in love, but it is not heaven, nor is it conscious, nor active. Heaven is a wholly good state inhabited by those who have been mortal incarnates, and who then have consciously chosen to live eternally in love. The point of this post is to emphasize that we have not known heaven. Heaven lies in our future, if we make that choice, but not in our past. Our ruling class are incompetent, but that is not the big problem. Bruce Charlton. The Western ruling class's preparations to create and escalate global war have been yet another litmus test of our time, revealing that the vast majority of even those commenters who regard themselves as solidly anti-left realists cannot comprehend how bad things really are. There has been for many years, and it is still increasing, a repetitive trope about how dumb, stupid, and all-round incompetent are the Western leadership class. Anti-woke analysts and commenters work themselves into a frenzy of exposition concerning declining IQ, declining competence, and idiotic doubling down on mistakes. All this is perfectly true, in itself, but incompetence is not the underlying and causal problem. The big problem is evil, not incompetence. The problem is evil motivations. The problem is what the ruling class want, not their inability to achieve it. If the ruling class were more able and intelligent, and less corrupt, then they would be using their competence to do more evil. The reason this is a litmus test is that it reflects the inability of most people, of almost everybody, it seems, to acknowledge and recognize the reality of deliberate, purposive evil. Most people don't even seem to notice that the incompetence always works in the same direction, i.e. towards evil, whereas genuine incompetence would err on both sides of right action, and would sometimes seek good by accident. And if you can't see evil when it is staring you in the face and doing its best to destroy the world, well, then you are absolutely certain to get it badly wrong about the motivations of the Western ruling class. Random thoughts as Midsummer's Day approaches. Francis Berger. I suppose it's superfluous to point out that the very same leaders, managers, and experts who insisted on shutting down the world back in 2020, even if it meant saving just one life, are now virtually all on board the let's have a great big war train. I have nothing but respect for roofers. I spent a day shingling a 4x3 meter shed roof, and I cannot tell you how relieved I was to come down from the roof at the end of that day. Not because I suffer from any acrophobia, but because roofing is demanding work. On the one hand, nailing shingles to boards is easy. On the other hand, the prolonged kneeling, squatting, craning, and climbing is quite taxing, to say nothing of the heat the shingles emit after the sun reaches a certain point in the sky. I have shingled many roofs in my time, and it never gets easier. I could not imagine doing that kind of work day in, day out. So, hats off to all the roofers in the world. The 5 new 12-week-old pullets I ordered in winter arrived last week. I set them up in a separate part of the run, and they appear to be doing great. However, they refuse to go into their coop at dusk and do everything short of tunneling to join the adult flock in its coop. I had to pick them up and carry them in the first 5 nights. I now coax them into the coop with my hands, but it would be much more convenient if they went in alone. Kids these days. I guess it rarely occurs to most conservative, reactionary, counter-evolutionary types that Auguste Comte inherited the idea of society über alles from traditionalist stalwarts such as de Maistre and de Binold. People avidly hire life coaches when they should be seeking a reputable death coach. Professional development sessions must fall under the jurisdiction of an incessantly malevolent class of demons specializing in ennui, inanity, torpor, and mind-numbing team-building starter activities. Has anyone out there ever attended a beneficial or engaging professional development session? Those answering in the affirmative should immediately seek the aid of an exorcist. Should we seek for God among the trash of Western culture? Bruce Charlton. In his exegesis, Philip K. Dick often returns to the theme that God, and the good, could be found among the trash of civilization, and only among the trash.
The right place to look for the Almighty is, for example, in the trash in the alley. And for Satan in vast cathedrals, etc.
This fitted with Philip's sustained interest in historical Gnosticism, by which this world is made by the devil, who is an evil demiurge, such that God, and good, can only penetrate this world, and eventually redeem it, make it good, by stealth and in disguise. Such Gnosticism, which he knew of partly via his friend the Bishop of California Jim Pike, who was involved in translating the Nag Hammadi library, appealed to Philip because he was very aware of the evils of this world, especially its suffering. Philip could not make intuitive sense of the traditional orthodox canonical Christian view that such a world as we inhabit was created and sustained by a wholly good and omnipotent God. On the other hand, Philip was not satisfied by the explanations of Gnosticism either, and therefore the exegesis displays many oscillations and explorations, and never settles on a final or wholly satisfying explanation. Leaving aside what I regard as the mistaken metaphysical assumptions of ancient Gnosticism, and indeed traditional canonical Christianity, there is certainly a strong case to be made that real Christianity is now to be found only among the detritus and at the edges of modern Western culture, and not in the cathedrals, temples, churches, seminaries and theological colleges, or their like. Nor indeed in mainstream mass media, nor high-status education and academia. As Western culture has become totalitarian and corrupted, then everything that is mainstream, official, popular, powerful, wealthy and high status, has been brought within the evil-motivated totalitarian system, and under the ultimate control of literal demons. Here and now, anything that is not on board with, and supportive of, the totality of systemic evil is forced to the margins, and demonized as trash. Christians themselves are already, and increasingly, regarded as and treated as trash by the world of mainstream officialdom and mass media, and the more truly Christian a person may be, the more he will be despised. So that the end result is superficially very much as assumed by ancient Gnostics and their sympathizers such as Philip, despite that Philip was essentially a man of the left, and there is a significant element of 60s counterculture nostalgie de la Bouée style posturing about the notion of seeking God in the trash. Nonetheless, and despite all reservations and contextualization, it is probably true in essence. Although most of the trash of our civilization is indeed rubbish, and some of it is very evil, as of 2024, in the West, we won't find God anywhere else. Thoughts so deep they're meaningless. Francis Berger. Adam Piggott has picked up on my criticism of professional development over at his blog. He describes a particularly curious team-building activity involving whitewater rafting. It's well worth a read if you haven't seen it. Team-building aside, reading Adam's post reminded me of the deep thoughts aspect of PD sessions, which serve as the pièce de resistance of those torturous events. Deep thoughts shared during professional development are meant to be earth-shattering, life-changing snippets of information that blow your mind and transform your thinking about life, the universe, and everything. You know they're deep because they're usually followed by learning nugget activities in which the PD participants collaborate in 5-minute mini-sessions with the learning outcome of unpacking the profound implications of the deep thought in question. Unfortunately, most of the deep thoughts expressed during professional development are deep enough to be essentially meaningless. Case in point, during one of the countless PD days I had to endure when I worked as a high school teacher, the mistress of ceremonies, yes, she referred to herself as that, shared the following deep thought. 75% of the jobs our students will do in the future don't exist yet. Our task as educators is to utilize our best practices to prepare our students for those non-existent jobs. After the sonic boom of the expressed deep thought subsided, I joined 4 of my colleagues in an impromptu learning nugget mini-session during which we were supposed to brainstorm the implications of the deep thought. I looked at my colleagues and said, deep. Real deep. So deep, it's meaningless. It was the only learning nugget I could offer in response to the sagacity of the deep thought that had been expressed. We cannot know what to do, so long as we are wrongly motivated. Bruce Charlton. We cannot know what to do, so long as we are wrongly motivated. This is something everybody seems to find it very difficult to grasp and hold on to. That, while we are in a situation of wrong motivation, we cannot know what is best for us to do. Therefore, any plans we make while wrongly motivated, will be bad plans, will make things worse. As Western society as a whole, and a large majority of its individual persons, are here and now so very wrongly motivated, there is currently no possibility at all of making, or even recognizing, plans for a better future. Yet, this is what people constantly clamor for. Indeed, they demand detailed flowcharts of how to manufacture a better future. Unsurprisingly, all the strategies that emanate from the West, and are supported by the usual run of corrupt and dishonest Westerners, are dystopian in the extreme. Their methods and aims are nightmarish, claustrophobic, anti-human, anti-life, because that is the only kind of plan we can imagine. This ought to be obvious common sense. And it is a measure of the depth of corruption that it is not obvious, and that so many people instead suppose that people and societies who have embraced value inversion yet deny it, might somehow be able to contrive a roadmap to social regeneration. Before we can even imagine a better world and how to get it, let alone commence to make such a world, we must first become better people. Indeed, not just better but transformed people, transformed in terms of our motivations, or it could be said transformed in terms of our perspective on reality and our place in it. This sounds wildly optimistic and ambitious, and yet it is a thing that any person can do for himself, and cannot be prevented from doing. It's all a question of wanting, and so we return to motivation. The ratio of doing to thinking. Bruce Charlton. Thinking is much more difficult and rare than doing, it is also of low status, which is why so little thinking gets done. I first realized this some 40 years ago when I began to work as a laboratory research scientist, and noticed that there was, in the biological and medical sciences anyway, extremely little thinking about the meaning of what we were doing. There was, indeed, active hostility, and scorn, directed against anything that challenged, or even seriously analyzed, whatever the currently accepted meanings and purposes of research doing. The ratio of doing to thinking was so high, that it seemed to me that very few bioscientists ever thought consecutively and in a focused way for even 10 minutes about their subject, or even their results. I formulated this in a kind of slogan that anyone who did succeed in thinking for 10 minutes about the implications and purposes of some research, thereby became a leading theoretician in that field. I was much more disposed towards thinking hard than I was to doing hard. Long hours in the lab were mostly a chore, though this was my daily work environment for more than 7 years. In the end, I soon decided that my edge as a scientist would come from focusing on solo theory rather than the usual practice of trying to generate vast quantities of data by forming vast teams of collaborators. I felt, and still feel, that this was a flaw in the biosciences and medicine, attempting to remedy which was why I edited Medical Hypotheses for 7 years, and I think the same applies to other sciences. So far as I can gather, even the theoretical scientists don't really think, but just apply externally learned models in a routine fashion. In other words, theory is not thinking, or, seldom so. Eventually, this insight became a kind of master theory about life. For nearly everybody, it seems that the ratio of doing to thinking is way too high, indeed apparently infinitely high in many people, i.e. they never think consecutively and in a focused way, so the ratio is some quantity, divided by 0. And this is a major reason why our civilization is where it is, self-painted into a corner where it is purposively destroying itself, and simultaneously trying to bring down the rest of the world from spite. No amount of doing will help, only thinking. some serious and sustained thinking. Very likely coming at the cost of less doing. Note, on average modern researchers do not, contrary to almost universal perception, publish significantly more papers than earlier scientists who worked largely alone. What the moderns actually do, is work in much larger teams, and share in more publications. The bigger the team, the more shared publications. But when the number of publications is divided by the number of authors, which has increased manyfold, there seems to have been no significant change in average publication rates. I am a Christian but William Wildblood. I'm not only a Christian. There is part of me that is pagan, particularly Greek, Celtic, and Norse, and part that is Hindu and part Buddhist. Part of me is an ancient Egyptian living in the space between the bright blue sky and hot yellow sand, and part a Chinese sage secluded in misty hills, and there are other parts too. Anywhere there is beauty and wisdom is somewhere to which I feel that, in some measure, I belong. All this is true and all of it matters to me. I would not be without any of it, which, I suppose, is a privilege of our otherwise spiritually benighted times in which we have easy access to the whole of history. Nonetheless, although I respond to and have absorbed many different influences, they are all assimilated into and subsumed by a fundamental Christianity. It is against Christ that everything is measured, and where there is any contradiction between him and it, he conquers. Other tributaries can flow into the Christian river, but the source of that river is Christ, and its flow is directed towards the kingdom of heaven where he is king. Like many people of my generation who engaged in the spiritual search, I went away from conventional Christianity to explore other traditions, though that was always on the outside looking in, as my main path was as described in my first book, from which the title of this blog was borrowed. I learnt much from these encounters, and they deepened my understanding of the spiritual world. They also helped me engage with Christianity on a more profound level when I returned to it, as in the familiar words of T.S. Eliot in his poem Little Gidding.
We shall not cease from exploration. And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started, and know the place for the first time.
So, although I now regard myself as a Christian in a fuller sense than I ever was, my appreciation of the spiritual path has certainly been enhanced by other approaches to it. I think we can all benefit from this, though I wouldn't say it is in any way necessary. I am aware of the old jibe that interest in comparative religion makes you comparatively religious, but what I am talking about is not comparative religion, but a serious exploration of the richness of spiritual life in its many guises. God has revealed himself fully only once, but he has left traces of himself in many places. What is about solstices and equinoxes? Francis Berger. I look forward to the solstices and equinoxes every year, but I can't for the life of me understand why. Perhaps there is something primordial ingrained into our consciousness, with some being more intrigued or sensitive to the movements of the earth around the sun and the lengthening or shortening of daylight hours. Today is the longest day of the year, with Midsummer's day a scant 4 days away. Though it will strike most as peculiar, when it comes to the idea of midsummer, I agree with Dr. Charlton's assessment, that the summer solstice/midsummer day marks the middle of the summer rather than its beginning. My garden provides ample evidence that this is indeed the case. The early blooming flowers have all withered away, while the later blossoming ones are now in full bloom. Though quite lush and green, the grass hints that it will soon take a break and dry out before engaging in a late or nothing growth spurt toward the beginning of August. The fattened onion bulbs bulge from the soil while the tops grow brown and wither. Most of the tomato plants are bearing fruit, albeit still green. The lettuce continues to grow but is slowly going to seed. Yes, there are still many hot summer days ahead. Yet, I would argue that half of summer is already behind us, and that people who take their summer holidays in mid-August are vacationing in early autumn despite all appearances to the contrary. The winter solstice as the middle of winter is an easier sell, particularly in northern countries where the days grow noticeably shorter, and the weather tends to turn for the worse after the autumn equinox in September. Although November is still officially autumn, people tend to regard it as a winter month, especially when the cold rains or first snowfalls arrive. By the time we get Christmas, we feel as if we have been in winter for a while, and very few people I know have ever declared the winter equinox or Christmas to be the beginning of winter. Why modern men, unlike earlier generations, need to regard Christian love as personal, not abstract. Bruce Charlton.
Mrs. Anstruther opened her eyes and met Pauline's. She smiled. "My dear," she said, "I've been meaning to ask you something for the last day or two." Pauline thought it might be the hot afternoon that gave the voice that effective distance. It was clear, but small and from afar. The words, the tone, were affectionate with an impersonal love. Pauline thought, she might be talking to Phoebe, Phoebe being the maid, and at the same time realized that Mrs. Anstruther did so talk to Phoebe, and to everyone. Her goodwill diffused itself in all directions. Her granddaughter lay in its way, with all things besides, and it mingled with the warm sun in a general benediction. As if in a last communion with the natural terrors of man, Margaret Anstruther endured a recurrent shock of fear. She recalled herself. To tolerate such knowledge with a joyous welcome was meant, as the holy doctors had taught her, to be the best privilege of man, and so remained. The best maxim towards that knowledge was yet not the know thyself of the Greek so much as the know love of the Christian, though both in the end were one. It was not possible for man to know himself and the world, except first after some mode of knowledge, some art of discovery.
The most perfect, since the most intimate and intelligent, art was pure love. The approach by love was the approach to fact. To love anything but fact was not love. Love was even more mathematical than poetry, it was the pure mathematics of the spirit. It was applied also and active, it was the means as it was the end. The end lived everlastingly in the means eternally in the end.
From Descent into Hell, by Charles Williams, 1937.
Love is regarded as the primary value of Christianity, yet that statement leaves it unclear what is meant by love, and indeed by Christianity. Speaking from my personal understanding, I regard it as a profound error when Christians strive to assert of love that it is ideally impersonal, universal, unconditional, impartial. I mean the error that love is best to be understood by abstract metaphors drawn from mathematics, physics, astronomy, and the like. Charles Williams was certainly very prone to asserting this perspective, as illustrated above by descriptions relating to Mrs. Margaret Anstruther, a character in the novel Descent into Hell, who is pretty clearly intended to represent Williams's idea of a modern saint, a genuinely wise and good person. In this novel and elsewhere, Williams frequently referred to his ideal situation as mathematical, a geometric pattern, characterized alike by precision and abstraction. But in this respect, except for his emphatic and stark rhetoric, Williams was not at all unusual among the mainstream of theologians from very early in Christian history. Indeed, Williams's attitude seems to me the normal and mainstream Christian theologians' view that ideal love, i.e. the love of God for all of creation, is necessarily impersonal. This due to the assumption that God as creator is of an utterly different nature and quality than any created thing, and because of God's attributes of omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, and God's unchanging/unemotional character, immutable and impassible, and therefore love, like God, is supposed to best be understood using impersonal metaphors. As I say, in contrast I regard love as necessarily personal, including ideal love, and God's love. I believe that such notions as universal, unconditional, impartial love are false importations from out with Christianity, whether the pre-Christian Greek, for example Pythagorean, Platonic, Aristotelian, and Roman, for example Neoplatonic, Stoic, philosophy, in the case of ancient Christian theologians, or from oneness belief/aspirations of, Western understandings of, Hinduism and Buddhism in the case of theologians of the past century plus. I believe abstract ideas of love are harmful to Christianity here and now. However, I do not think that such false theology did much harm in the past, in the pre-modern era. The reason is to do with the development of human consciousness, and the rather gradual but progressive loss of what Barfield terms original participation. I mean, that mankind began having a natural and spontaneous, and largely unconscious, immersion in the world of the divine and of spirits. But that men have gradually, over centuries, and millennia, become more self-conscious, and more separated from this divine spirit world, until now the separation is very nearly complete, except in early childhood. This modern separation from the spiritual and divine, and from participation in the world, is sometimes called alienation. This separation is also a development of the potential for freedom. But separation means that men now need to make a conscious and active choice of beliefs, and we cannot, do not, unconsciously benefit from an implicit knowledge of God and creation, and God's will. In different words, men used to find themselves automatically aligned with divine creation and God, to a significant degree, whereas now men find themselves alienated from creation to the point of denying the reality of creation and God. What this meant was that in the past men could hold all kinds of false beliefs, including the falsehoods of mainstream Christian theology, without coming to significant harm, whereas nowadays, because our theology is actively and consciously chosen, false theology is harmful, and indeed nearly always leads out of Christianity. As for Charles Williams, he was regarded by several influential intellectual Christians, especially adult reconvert authors such as C.S. Lewis, T.S. Eliot, Dorothy L. Sayers, W.H. Auden, but also a significant following of disciples, as an exemplary and inspiring Christian writer, and indeed person. In my opinion, for all Williams' many flaws, this informed positive evaluation of Charles Williams as Christian and theologian deserves considerable weight. On the other side, a knowledge of Charles Williams' biography, including autobiographical writings, suggests that he found his own religious understanding to be deeply unsatisfactory, indeed tragic to a degree only a hair's breadth away from despair and apostasy, yet, a hair's breadth away, i.e. Charles Williams remained Christian, and continued to hope. Williams' religion was rigorously derived from his theological assumptions, far more rigorously so than for most theologians. Yet, even among the mass of not rigorous Christians, assumptions have consequences, and I believe that the assumption that Christian love ought to be impersonal, mathematical, has taken a terrible toll on the faith of individual people, causing variously disbelief, confusion, disgusted rejection, and opening the door to assimilation of Christianity with the abstractions of satanic totalitarianism. Therefore, what was, only just, possible for Charles Williams, i.e. to have a false understanding of love and yet be Christian, is probably not possible for those born several generations later and in our grossly corrupted civilization. We, here and now, must be clear and explicit that love is personal and interpersonal, and that God is a person, and of the same kind as ourselves, else we will, sooner or later, whether acknowledged or denied, not be Christians.